broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone and welcome to the IWFM webinar. Today you're joining us to talk about the role, the role of facilities management companies in increasing recycling in England. And then a very hot topic in terms of FMs and the environment at the moment. So that's a picture of me, Peter Brogan, Head of Research and Insight here at the IWFM. Just a bit of context around the purpose of the team I lead up is to give first-class research and insight, supporting FMs and developing content. And this is a visual representation of some of the outputs, and you will see there that next week we'll be launching our very own good practice guide on recycling waste and resource management supported by our economy. So it goes nicely with today's presentation in terms of some guidance on the back to look at after listening to this webinar. And you can see there we have a number of guidance notes and good practice guides and researcher reports around a number of subject areas that relate to workplace and FM. And documents can be found on our IWFM website. So as mentioned there, our Recycling Waste and Resource Management GPG will be launched next week. I did say this week, but I got informed this morning it will be early part of next week. The new version includes sections on the circular economy, economic and environmental value, social value, and some points there that you can see in good communication and regular auditing. So we'll recommend for you to have a look out for that GPG next week. Also, it's worth mentioning at this point, we have done a number of policy activity around the area of sustainability and particularly waste and recycling. For example, we're looking at the Social Value FM plugin with the National Social Value Task Force, and my colleague Sophie Hooper, Head of Policies, leading up a lot of this activity. We're looking at building on the guidance I mentioned there and looking at sustainable procurement guidance and looking at that. Also, as part of working with Defra, who you're going to hear from today, we're also working with RAP in terms of some of their campaigns and a Guardians of Grub campaign, which some of our listeners will be aware of. Tying in with government and the legislative process, which echoes and repeats some of what the presentation today will go through from my colleagues at Defra, and spreading the message around our networks and community. So with research and insight and mainly policy, we work hand in hand in terms of some of the activity on this. I just wanted to highlight some of the areas that we're doing as an institute around this topic area. So you've not come on this webinar to listen to me, I appreciate that. And our two speakers today, you can kindly see there, Sam Hare and Robert Vaughan. Robert Vaughan is Head of Household Waste Collection and Recycling Policy, and he will be joining us for the Q&A session towards the end of this presentation. So at this point, I'd like to remind people to send their questions through on the chat function. There is a dedicated Q&A session as part of this webinar. We also have some polls as well to make it as interactive as possible. And also the webinar is being recorded. So again, you can distribute to your colleagues and respective networks after the webinar as well. So Robert started his current post in 2014. He's responsible for policy and regulation on the collection and recycling of household waste and for digestion strategy. He's currently leading on policies to improve the quantity and quality of dry recycling materials and food waste collected in England. Robert joined Defra in 2008 as Head of National and Local Air Quality with responsibility for policy on air quality, working with other departments on measures to reduce air pollution. So there you've got a vast experience with Robert, and as I promised, he will be joining us for the Q&A session. Our main speaker though is Sam Hare, Waste Collection and Recycling Policy Advisor. Sam joined the Waste and Recycling team at Defra this year, working on the government's recent consultation, consistency in household and business recycling collections in England, particularly focusing on business collection and food waste treatment policy. Sam joined Defra in 2018, working on EU exit implementations for science. Prior to that, he worked in both science and teaching after completing a master's degree in chemistry. So for our listeners, it's always important to know who the speakers are, a bit of their background. So at this point, enough from me. I encourage people to use the chat function as much as they can. And at this point, I'd like to hand over to Sam to talk you through the presentation. So hopefully technology working. Sam, I should be handing over to you.
Hi, Peter. Hi, thank you. And hello, everyone else. Thank you very much for that great introduction. And yeah, hopefully you can all hear me now. As Peter mentioned, I'm Sam, Waste Collection and Recycling Policy Advisor at Defra. Robert is with me in the room at the moment, and he'll be covering the Q&A aspect of the presentation afterwards. So today we're going to be talking about how facilities management companies such as yourself can play a large role in informing future government policy, and discuss a little bit about best practice for FM companies. We had a recent consultation on increasing recycling consistency that covered both households and businesses. Obviously, businesses are going to be of main interest to you guys, so that's what we're going to be focusing on with a little bit of context on the household side. And as Peter mentioned, the presentation will be broken up with some polling questions, so I'll be looking for some feedback during the presentation from you. So the idea of increased recycling consistency hasn't come out of the blue. It's something that's been bubbling away for a number of years, and there have been a number of publications over the past couple of years especially that have seen a push towards a more circular economy, moving away from the more linear take, make, use, throw model of material use. This started off with the two publications you can see on the left, which are the Industrial Strategy and the Clean Growth Strategy. And following that, our 25-year environment plan was published in 2018, which really was a landmark publication for the government and for Defra, which put a lot more detail on how we were going to achieve more resource efficiency. This was followed by the lovely pink-looking document you can see on the right of your screen, which is our resources and waste strategy, which put a bit more meat on the bones of recycling consistency and said exactly what proposals we're going to go forward with, especially with a view towards EU exit and maintaining a circular economy beyond that. So, as I mentioned, we've recently had a round of consultations. There were 4 in total. So we consulted in the summer on a deposit return scheme for drinks containers, increasing producer responsibility for packaging, as well as consistency in recycling collections, which is the one at the top that we're going to be talking about today. There was also a 4th consultation that wasn't Defra-led, it was led by the Treasury, on introducing a plastic packaging tax, but all 4 of those consultations ran side by side and closed in the summer. So recycling consistency, the consultation closed in July. We had a large number of responses, over 1,700 in total, from individuals, so normal householders who had a view on recycling, as well as over 500 from stakeholders. So that would be things like local authorities, companies, businesses, etc., trade bodies for associated industries. So following that consultation, we are looking towards a second consultation next year, 2020, which will put a bit more detail about our proposed implementation strategy for the proposals in our first consultation. Up until that time, we'll be working with key stakeholders such as yourselves and the other ones that I previously mentioned to refine the policy detail a little bit more and look for more evidence to improve our impact assessment further. So, moving on to the first polling question of the day. So the question is, do you have discussions with businesses whose facilities that you work with on the management of waste for recycling? So 5 options you can see on your screen, ranging from always down to never. If you would be able to vote now, and we'll sort of give the technology 10-20 seconds to see if it works, but yeah, you should just be able to vote by clicking on your screen. If there are any problems with the voting, then please put it in the chat box so that we can see. So once again, the question is, do you have discussions with businesses whose facilities you work with on the management of waste for recycling? So a very broad question, but just want to get an idea of how frequent these conversations are. Okay, excellent. So yeah, as you can see, the most popular response was always, followed by sometimes, and then most of the time. So that's great to hear, with rarely and never not getting a lot of votes. So yeah, that's good. Obviously, we would like it to be always for everyone, and we're going to be discussing a bit more in this webinar about how we can do that. So moving back to recycling consistency, where has the drive for greater consistency in recycling come from? Well, it's now sort of around the turn of the millennium, recycling rates are very low at around 11%, and they've risen to around 45% in recent years, so there was a massive increase in recycling. However, it's no secret that they stagnated in recent years at remaining around 44-45%. We've got ambitious recycling targets, for example, 65% of household and business waste to be recycled by 2035, and the current drivers to achieve those sort of numbers are insufficient to do so. There are issues with recycling. Householders are often confused over what can and can't be recycling, and in particular on the business side, although there isn't a lot of data on business recycling, the level of recycling in businesses are relatively low, and the quality of the material collected for recycling is also inconsistent. So like I said, I'm just going to give a little bit of context on the household side, but this is not the main part of interest. So for householders or individuals, we proposed in our consultation for there to be a core set of materials from all households, including flats, which would be paper and card, glass, plastic, and metal packaging. We would look for there to be consistency on the materials collected, so the ones that I just mentioned, but local decision making is important on exactly how these materials are collected. So whether that's in multiple containers or fewer containers. However, we appreciate that more containers, high quality recycler is generally better. We propose there to be a regular review of this core set of materials, a weekly separate food waste collection, and also minimum service standards on collection. So the results for the householder part of the consultation were overwhelming support for the core set of materials and the regular review. So we will be seeking to legislate to ensure that this core set is collected by all local authorities in England from 2023. And there's also large support for separate food waste collections. So that says by 2023 on the screen, but it should say from 2023. Again, we'll be legislating from 2023, and also again large support for statutory guidance. So we're producing that by working with stakeholders. We appreciate as well there'll be some contractual and local circumstances of local authorities which will be considered with the time frame of this legislation. So moving on to the bit that you're all interested in, business recycling proposals. We estimate that around 2 million businesses and other organisations produce municipal or household-like waste, which could be recycled. We want to increase the recycling rates in the sector. They're currently low, but our impact assessment has predicted that they could be over 74% with the proposals that we've gone forward with. We want all businesses to segregate dry recyclable waste from our residual waste. So in our consultation, we set forward 3 options. of different types of segregation. So from the most segregated, which would be mixed dry recycling with separate glass and separate food waste, to different options where you don't have food waste or don't have glass waste collection. So we want all business and organisations that produce sufficient quantities of food waste to separate their food waste from their residual waste. We're interested, related to this proposal, we're interested in things like exemptions, things like how a food waste producing business should be defined, what does sufficient mean, should there be a de minimis threshold, and we also propose a number of options of reducing the cost, particularly for SMEs, which I'll go into a little bit more detail on the next slide. And we proposed improvements to the waste data reporting system for businesses because it's not done throughout all businesses currently. So we'll be going on to cost reduction options after the polling question. So polling question, first of all, the question is, do you provide separate collection of materials, so metal, paper, glass and plastics, for the businesses that you work with? So we're interested in where these four waste streams are segregated for these businesses. So you have metal in one bin, paper in one bin, glass in one, and plastics in another. So again, 5 options from always all the way through to never. So if you could vote in the same manner as last time, that'd be excellent. And as always, for Gift of Technology, a little bit of time just to collate the responses. So once again, the question is, do you provide separate food waste, separate collection of materials? So the 4 materials that I outlined previously for the businesses that you work with. Again, a very broad question. So the results of that poll are, as you can see on the screen, always is the most popular option. So again, that's great to hear because the government supports separation of separation of different streams where it is technically, environmentally and economically practical to do so. And again, a bit of a mixture going down to the lower end of the scale. So there's interestingly a fair chunk that never provide this type of collection, but again, the others are mixed. So I believe there should be one more polling question. Yeah, one more polling question before we get back to the presentation. So the question is, do you provide separate food waste collections for the businesses that you work with? Again, you know the drill, it's the same 5 options as the last 2 times. So just talking about food waste, not the dry recyclables that the previous question was about. Do you provide a separate food waste collection, separate from the other streams for businesses that you work with? And the results of that poll are in. And again, there's a large number of companies that always produce separate food waste collection. Again, there is a significant chunk that never have. So there does seem to be two different ends of the scale and a mixture in the middle. So again, a bit of a mixed response, but good to see that the proportion of always answers is pretty high. So should be going back to the presentation. As I mentioned previously, there are a number of cost reduction options that we proposed in our consultation. So this would be for smaller micro firms, SMEs, because our analysis shows that the cost of segregating food, segregating different streams increases substantially for these type of businesses. However, for large and medium-sized firms, there is a benefit financially from our proposed measures. So there's a handful of options for minimizing costs that you can see on the screen there, just to pick out a few examples. One option could be collection of household and business waste for recycling with each other, collaborative procurement, so that could, for example, be between SMEs in the same area, and financial incentives for SMEs to encourage recycling. Okay, so this is probably the key take-home slide, which is the results for our business part of the consultation. There was support for separate recycling and food waste from residual waste. The most popular option of the ones that I mentioned was the most segregated version, option 3. So mixed dry recycling, separate glass and separate food waste from businesses. But as I mentioned previously, we do support the segregation of different streams where it's possible to do so. There are a lot of responses about considering best support for SMEs to make the transition, and we'll be working with stakeholders, including yourself, as we refine those options going forward to the next consultation. And there was, for example, support of greater collaboration and sharing of services between SMEs, and support for zoning, waste franchising, as well as a combination of household waste, a combination of business waste with household waste streams. And again, support for waste data collection, which we'll refine further in the second consultation. So as you can see, general support for these proposals pretty much across the board. I should also say one of our proposals on the de minimis threshold, so whether there's a minimum weight of food waste below which you should not have to collect food waste, we are considering further as part of the next consultation. So this is, I believe, the final polling question of the presentation. So the question is, what is the single biggest barrier to recycling for businesses? So this is different to the other polling questions. If you could put your answers into the chat so we can see what sort of things come up, that would be great. So just click on the chat panel and type the message in there. So one word answers only, please. Looking for the sort of things that prevent businesses from segregating their recycling. So there are some, I'm struggling to see that, but there are some answers coming through. Employees, culture, cost, yeah, all potential barriers. Just sort of give it 10 more seconds if you could put your single word answers into the chat box. Confusion, personnel, so again that ties in with employees. Education as well. Waste companies, that is a 2-word answer, but I'll let you off. Impractical as well. So yeah, there are, I think the key, again, I think that's another cost that's just come through. So the key take-home message from that is we appreciate there are a lot of barriers to recycling for businesses, but part of our job is to make sure that they're minimised. So these are often mentioned potential barriers for implementation in businesses. Space is often mentioned as a potential issue, particularly for segregation in small areas such as for SMEs. Contamination of recyclable waste, particularly with food waste and drinks, or food waste and dry mix recycling, which can lower the value of the recycler, make it less valuable, and also contaminate it. What's the incentive to actually recycle? So ensuring that there's engagement and drivers around segregation of waste. Going back to someone mentioned confusion, so variation in bin colours and signage, and again, variation of materials collected by different waste contractors can make recycling confusing. Waste data reporting, which I mentioned earlier as part of our consultation, and location, particularly for businesses that are either rural or inner city and have space or contractual problems for recycling. So in terms of Defra, the next steps for us are to this is really the policy development stage, so we're working on more detailed proposals to go forward for the second consultation that I mentioned, which will likely be in spring, summer 2020. And I would encourage you to respond to that consultation as well when it does go live, and also drafting regulations for consultation in 2020. The indicative timescale is for these proposed measures to be implemented from 2023. There's the link for the government response to the first consultation that I mentioned. You can also get it from just typing in recycling consistency consultation into a web browser, and it will come up. And yeah, we would like to get your views on particularly the proposals and the barriers to implementation as well. So this is my final slide, which is just a bit of food for thought to leave you with before we go on to the Q&A aspect with Robert. So Peter mentioned at the start of the presentation the good practice guidance, which will be coming out next week, and just what sort of economic, environmental and social value does recycling bring for FM companies? How can FM companies work with businesses to ensure the provision of containers, and how can FM companies work to push waste further up the waste hierarchy? So we've spoken a lot today about recycling, but we want to encourage the waste hierarchy where possible, and we appreciate that prevention of waste is by far the most important, so making sure waste doesn't get to a state where it has to be recycled. So that's the end of the presentation aspect. We're now going to move over to Q&A. If you would, again, be able to put any questions that you have for Robert in the chat box, that would be excellent. I can't see any at the moment, but I'm not sure, Peter, if you had a question that you would like to ask Robert.
We've actually got quite a few. We've got quite a few questions already come in, actually.
Okay, excellent. I'll hand it over to you then, Robert.
So Robert, if you're okay to take over on the Q&A, as I've been monitoring and listening intently, Sam, we've had a range of questions come through. The polling worked very well. So Robert, you've been able to review some of those as they come through. Just want to make listeners aware that we've dedicated quite a long section for the Q&A, and that's probably been reflective in the amount of questions we've got. So Robert, if you can go for as many questions as we can, but for listeners that questions aren't answered today, we will obviously kindly pass on to Robert and Sam, and we get a detailed response back. But enough of me again. I'd like to pass over to Robert just to go through the Q&A session.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. So we've got a few questions. One question from Paul White. First question is, can we get a better steer on what types of plastic and other materials are recyclable? Can't always rely on a recycling symbol. I think it's a very good question, actually. One of the things we are doing as part of this package of reforms that Sam talked about is around changing responsibilities for producers, so that they're required to provide much clearer labelling on what is recycled and what is not recyclable rather. In the consultation we had on producer responsibility back in the spring, this was the biggest issue that came out of that, and the importance of having clear labelling on products and materials to make clear what is recyclable. So we will be looking to do that as part of the consultation next year, to look at the detail of the labelling, and we want something simple such as recycle me, don't recycle me, almost. And we will be looking at providing further guidance as well on recyclability as part of our next consultation. So that's an area we want to definitely address. Similar question again from Paul White there on breast size plastics are recyclable. If I move on to the next question, how are we working with disposal companies? Question from Rose Olivier, sorry. How are we working with disposal companies to make it easier for companies to recycle responsibly? Showing some companies pay lip service to recycling while charging extra. I think this process here where we're having a seminar is part of the way of getting the message out to waste disposal companies and also to waste facilities managers, and we will be working with you much closer to look at how we can improve practice with recycling. And I think it's an area where we'd be interested in views on how what other ways we get the message out to different companies. A further question from George Coles. I've been told in regards to recycling plastic bottles, clear water are best. I think clear bottles are certainly are the best in terms of recycling. Clear water bottles they're PET, so they're certainly better bottles to recycle. But I think most plastics are recyclable. I think there it's important again at the moment to check the labelling. But PET bottles are the most easily recyclable. So water bottles are certainly recyclable. Moving down to further questions. There's a question on differentiating between opportunities to recycle within the building and externally. Most recycling is separated inside, but put into dry waste bins outside. I think that's from Keith Whitaker there. I think that's an important point, actually. I think what we want to do is to have a higher separation of materials for recycling, because that improves the quality. I think the challenge, though, is ensuring there's clear messaging and communications between you as facilities managers and your waste providers, your waste disposal providers. I think there, if you're taking the effort to segregate materials within the building, it's important to make sure that they take account of that when they collect the materials and send them to be recycled, because then they'll get better value for those materials. I think it's be interesting to know how well that communication works and how well easily it is to how often it happens where materials do separate in the building are actually then mixed together outside, which seems to be a redundancy or efforts there. So going through, so one question on data reporting. I think that's an interesting point, that data reporting is a challenging issue, that there are ways and means of improving data reporting. I think one of the most common facilities is to weigh the material, and lots of companies have weighing scales where they can separate out which different companies are providing waste to be weighed. I think there it would be interesting to talk further about with waste and facilities, the Institute of Waste and Facilities Managers, to see what we can do there to improve data reporting. And we welcome your thoughts on that, really. I think data reporting is an area which is very, very sort of poor within the commercial sector. The most focus has been on how local authorities report data, but there's scope to improvement there. I'd be interested in thoughts on that for our second consultation. There's a question on DRS, just briefly on DRS. I think the challenge here from Andreas Sekuskas, I'm sorry, I haven't pronounced that very well, Andreas. Question on DRS and the fact it's operating currently in other countries such as Lithuania. I think the main challenges with implementing a DRS are around, firstly, there's a lot of infrastructure to set up and it'll take some years to set that up. Secondly, we have to change legislation to introduce the DRS, so we have to do that first before we're in a position to legally introduce the DRS. And finally, there's some work to be done on how that the actual DRS process, which is a deposit return scheme, would impact upon other waste collectors, such as local authorities and private waste collectors, to see how it would change their practices and managing that transition as well. So we are minded to introduce a DRS, but we're looking at the issues around addressing that currently. A question from Isabel Virnois asking about, will you be changing the current policy of payments for recyclables going overseas being 100%, even though they often don't get recycled, where actual recycling percentage for recycling for UK recycling is paid at actual recycling rates? Is this an area that has been looked at as part of the producer responsibility reforms? And we'll be saying more about that in our second consultation, but it's certainly an area we recognise has caused problems for UK recycling in the past, so something we're looking at currently. A question from Simon Park. How will you be dealing with new bioplastic waste streams? Producers sell these products as commercially compostable, yet a facility is not in place in some regions. Obviously, it's important with bioplastics and compostable materials that you look carefully at the labelling for those to make sure they actually are compostable or degradable in compost facilities, because not all of them are, and some bioplastics actually can't be recycled very effectively at all, and it's an area where we have some concerns about making sure that the materials used are properly compostable and properly labelled. So it's an area we know that many facilities management companies work with biocompostable plastics and materials in their kitchen areas and so on. It's important that we actually make sure that the materials used are compostable and are clearly labelled as so. It's an area that we're developing under the producer responsibility heading. I think I've covered many of the questions that have come in for now. There's any I've missed. On food waste, from George Coles, he asks, food waste, is it difficult for companies to use biodegradable bags with the amount of food waste they create? Any recommendations? I think certainly yes, for company level, there are quite challenges there in using smaller biodegradable bags. It's probably an area we need to explore further and discuss further with waste facilities managers actually, as to how to manage that. There are certainly within the building we use here, the company here uses large bins without biodegradable bags and then separates out the food waste at a later stage. But it's an area that certainly we could explore further there, see what options are available. Just going through to find other questions. A question from Claudette Curtis there on recycling post-Brexit. I think recycling itself and the activities on waste management won't be affected by EU exit, as we will still be collecting waste. I think the challenge will be around exports materials and how we manage those. That's the main area for exploration, as in many other things to do with the exits around the export of materials and import of materials. But I think it won't actually affect the arrangements for collection. A question from Richard Cairns on plastics being recyclable. Not all plastics are recyclable. Can legislation be brought into place to make manufacturers use recyclable packaging? This again, as part of our producer responsibility initiative, we will be changing the law to require producers to look more carefully at the recyclability of their packaging, and they will be charged a sort of different fee for more recyclable packaging compared to less recycled packaging. So if producers produce packaging which is hard to recycle, they'll be charged higher fees to cover the costs of managing that material. And it'll incentivize producing a more recyclable packaging. It's an area we'll be consulting on next year. There's a question here on, we're currently segregating waste from Simon Park, currently segregating waste into 4 streams, paper, card, plastic and cans, only for them to be disposed of as dry mixed recycling. Are we better off sticking with extra segregation, switching it only to dry mixed recycling? Again, I think this is, in terms of quality, you will improve the quality if you collect the materials separately. And I think it's something to discuss with your waste disposal provider, your waste provider, as to whether you can encourage them also to work with them to ensure the materials remain segregated afterwards. I think the important thing is to remember that glass materials are the most problematic in recycling because they cause damage to paper and card, but also other things like food contamination and liquid contamination can cause problems as well. So it's important to think carefully before you move from separate collected materials to dry mix recycle. Think about the technical and economic and environmental conditions around the collection arrangements. I think there's a question here from Anne Beavis, asking, whilst recycling rates are helpful for managing and reporting recycling levels in business rates, they do not capture or encourage prevention or reuse. What metrics do you think would be more useful for driving more circular business practices? It's a very good question, actually, on the importance of prevention and reuse. Recycling is only one part of what we call the waste hierarchy, and prevention and reuse of materials should come first. It is an area we're looking at in terms of how we can improve metrics on waste prevention. Things that can be looked at is how efficient we are at using resources, how much we actually reduce the use of resources and rely on those, how much we're able to reuse materials, like recirculate furniture or recondition laptops and so on. But I think it's quite a good question. It's an area of research we're looking at the moment to see what we can do to improve our understanding of metrics on prevention and reuse. There's a question from Rose Oliveira asking what work's been done with local authorities to make recycling standards more consistent. Here, as part of the work that Sam mentioned in the presentation, we will be legislating in the near future to require local authorities to collect the same range of materials. So collect the same range of plastics, paper, metal, card and glass and so on. But then we will be allowing local decision making on how they're collected because the different circumstances local authorities face. But we will be requiring consistency in what is collected, and that'll be from 2023. I think I've covered a lot of the questions that have come in. Are there any questions I haven't addressed, do you think, Peter?
Yeah, Robert, we had a raft of questions come through, and I appreciate you've shifted through and answered, should I say, as many of those questions as we can. The system for listeners' questions that haven't been answered will be obviously passed on to Robert and Sam respectively to come back with a response. But there are a raft of questions there ranging across the topic, which naturally, because of the size of the topic area we're covering today, were vast in terms of the levels and the content in terms of the questions they're asking. So thank you, Robert. I guess, Robert, a question from myself is a bit of a challenge for IWFM and some of the members on this webinar. Is how actively can we get involved in the second consultation to ensure that FMs have a voice or a representation in those great sample sizes you have on your surveys? So I guess it's just a bit of a call to action for our members. So it'd be good to understand from Defra how our members certainly could get involved in that. And I appreciate Sam did go through that, but it might be just worth repeating the message.
Yes, I think there's a number of ways we can keep in touch with yourself through the IWFM. I think it'd be interesting to see how well the good practice guide goes down with your members. I think that's a very valuable document there, and it's a well put together document, I think, as well. You kind of send us a sort of advanced copy. I think that's very helpful. I think the important thing is we'll keep in touch with you through the IWFM. And I think if we can maybe look at a sort of future seminar of this type or a workshop where we could possibly engage with facilities managers, representatives of them, to discuss recycling practices, and then maybe look at how the consultation is developing through that process, perhaps.
Yeah, certainly from our perspective, it will certainly be the guidance as mentioned, and that will be released next week. But the future workshops and consultations is certainly something as an institute with our collaboration with Defra to let members know we'll actively get involved with, and there'll be news on our website when those opportunities arise. Because even from this webinar today, we've seen the scale of interest and the impact it has on our membership, and particularly the facilities management sector. So again, the conversations won't stop purely at this webinar, and it's key for us to continue the debate and consultations with Defra and collaborate on their consultations. So again, for members, we will announce when there's opportunity on getting involved with those initiatives. So from my perspective, I want to say a massive thank you to Sam, who you heard from the presentation today in terms of Defra's work and how you could get involved in the consultation. Robert, thank you in terms of answering the raft of questions that were firing through. The technology worked well. You answered as many of the questions as we can, but as promised, we'll get back to listeners that didn't quite get their questions answered today, and apologies for that. Again, a reminder for the third time, our guide GPG on recycling waste supported by Economy will be launched next week, so please have a look out with that. Obviously, for future announcements with our work with Defra, we'll keep people posted on the website, and obviously we've got details from the participants today, so we know the level of interest is high, so we will make sure that those who've joined the webinar we'll keep in touch with future activity. Also, to remind people, this webinar will be available on our website shortly, so ideally this week, promises, and that will help you cascade to, as I said earlier in the presentation, to your networks as well as your fellow colleagues, just to spread the word on the activity for such an important subject. And lastly, a massive thank you for our listeners for tuning in to this webinar. Hopefully you got a flavour of the activity from IWFM's perspective and Defra, and how we're going to continue the collaboration going forward on such an important subject matter. So thank you again. Look out for the webinar and guide, and look forward to seeing some of you shortly for our next webinar. So thank you again.
Thank you.